one of our own Boone Countyans who's going to speak to us on gardening. He is Mark Lawhorn. Mark and his wife, Mary Ellen Pesic, share a gardener's life in their 6-acre fantasy Big Boone Gardens. They open their gardens 12 weeks a year to share their love and knowledge of horticulture. They sell a large collection of unusual and aquatic plants. The garden contains hundreds of plants, several water gardens, a historic log cabin, formal herb garden, garden museum, and even an elaborate gnome garden. Mark worked for several years for a nursery and garden center to learn the basics, and then spent 10 years as a gardener for the Cincinnati Park Board. Among his many assignments were 7 years at Crone Conservatory and 3 years as head gardener at Cincinnati's All Park. Mark has designed and installed over 50 gardens, including more than a handful of gold medal winners at the Cincinnati Flower Show for several different organizations. For the last 13 years, Mark has worked on both public and private gardening projects. His gardens receive Best Of awards in many Cincinnati communities. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, Mark. Thank you.
It's nice to be here this time of year and be showing slides on gardening. Many times we do that at home this time of year when we get a little bit of cabin fever, and we'll rack up a bunch of things and show how green it can be again. So it's really a pleasure to share some of that with you this time of year. Why do we garden? Well, it used to be out of need, but now it's pretty much because you like to influence your environment and make your environment all that it can be. Many of us do a lot in terms of decorating inside the house, but most of us don't think about the wonderful views that can be had outside each window that nobody can take away with you day in and day out. A complete fantasy garden, which I've had the pleasure to actually have completed 50 gardens, and most of us in our lifetime struggle to complete the one that we work with. So as you might imagine, I'm a very tough critic. My expectations and ideas are very high and very advanced, and like I said, it makes me a tough critic sometimes. We know some of the members of the organization, and we're very thankful for those that we don't know. The year before last, we were awarded a plaque. They called us from the Historical Society and said, we like your home, we recognize it as being a historic home. And members of this group awarded us this plaque that has circa 1871, and at no cost to us. So it goes along with our theory: if you build it, they will come. If you do something great, it'll be acknowledged. And the idea of gardening is just an idea. A seed is an idea. It has no value until it's nurtured, cared for, and seen through to the idea that it was dreamed to be. So we use seeds as a starting point for an idea about the way things can be, and then you add things to the garden. Many of the gardens we worked in for 10 years already. A lot of them are scoring in the high 90s, and that would be 90% of what I had imagined at the beginning. It's not that it requires a great deal of money. It does require a great deal of work, but if you have this conceptual idea, then everything that you grow can be added to your garden to make it the dream that you had envisioned from the start. Seeds, by their very nature, or like I said, they're just an idea. They're an abstract thing until they're grown and planted and seen to fruition. And it does require some effort to grow seeds. It's not the easiest thing to do. It does require some skill. It only requires the most basic of equipment and understanding and a lot of hard work. An idea, hard work, time equals success. So, like I said, why do we garden? We garden to control our own environment. A visitor to our garden said it best: Mark, you and your wife have a right idea about living. You've surrounded yourselves with things of great interest and beauty, and therefore you'll have an interesting and beautiful life. And I like that. I mean, it was early on when we first started building the garden, but we used that as a guide for how and why we live our life to a great deal. Many of the seeds that we grow now, the things that we grow, we take for granted. The dandelion is a weed that was introduced from France. The teasel is a weed that came from France. The honeysuckle bush came from China. The vine honeysuckle came from Japan. The potato was grown in the Andes at different levels of elevation and supported the whole group of Incas. Was brought by the Spanish in 1530, that early, to not the United States, to Europe. It languished in the markets. It showed up in Seville as a market crop around 1570, and it took a while to get established in the Europeans' colony. At the time, there was this doctrine of likes, they called it. If you ate something like a potato with its scaly skin and warts, you were going to have skin problems and warts break out. So it was really hard to tell the people of the medieval generation to eat a lot of these things, and they used them most often for cattle fodder, hog fodder. It took a long time to really popularize that particular crop. It came back to the United States in the 1720 with settlers from Ireland that came back to the United States, and they brought back the Irish potato, which was actually from the United States in the first place, in the Americas in the first place. There's a long history of exploration with seeds around the world. In 1600, when they were the civil wars were over in Europe, they established great gardens in the countryside. They could garden outside the walls of the castle or monastery for the first time, and they became interested in flowers for flowers' sake and gardening for gardening's sake. This insatiable thirst caused them to send people all around the world to collect plants for their gardens because it was in vogue. They had the money during that time. And the British, of all people, their natural plants were very, very poor. They had wheat, they had a few berries, but not many great food crops or things of that nature. The population in the early 1500s was not really extended that far into Ireland and places of that sort because they could only grow wheat, and wheat would not grow in the northern elevations. When potato crops came, one man could live off half an acre with a goat and provide the whole sustenance that he needed. So it led to the whole explosion of population through Europe over 200 years. I just wanted to tell you how important seeds are as far as distribution around the world, how they've come and gone. Early sailors would bring them back on their conquests. They would be distributed to organizations and grown and then distributed all over Europe. And many of our native plants that we know and love have come back from Europe in different colors, different forms, different shapes, after 200 years of hybridization with our plants that they had and experimented with for years before we had them. Around 1600, when the colonists came to Jamestown, they had about 75 to 100 plants that were listed in Gerard's herbals that were grown by the English during that time, a very small amount. By 1640, with the invent of the English insatiable quest for plants, the next herbals listed near 2,000 varieties that were grown in England. So in a short period of time, with the extra economy, the lack of civil wars, and the ability to actually grow a civilization, the amount of plants from around the world became phenomenal. Also with the insatiable quest came the early Victorians that sent out people all around the world that discovered all the plants of the tropicals and the Amazon that they brought back to England for hothouse plants. A lot of the interesting bulbs and things that we knew all over the world. So you kind of take for granted, unless you know the long history of where plants came from and how they were grown, about their real origins. And there's a lot of twists and turns about how these things had arrived. In our gardens, we like to see a particular image or thought carried out. It may be something simple like a cutting garden with hot colors that I can use for complementing my house. But once the idea or theme is established, then all the elements that are grown are based on fulfilling that theme. It's nice to be able to sit in a garden that's truly your vision of Eden, and that would be total enclosure, privacy, not looking at your neighbor's blue tarp covering his wood pile, not looking at the neighbor's pool with the kids playing, the people that don't let their dogs run free. So some type of enclosure or real personal space is important in what you would call a real garden. Many of the great gardens of our time were very large and took great staffs and really a lot to them, hundreds of gardeners. But some of the greatest gardens that have been devised have taken the old themes, the old ideas, and condensed them down to a human size. So they would take 200-acre gardens, but the essence of them could be put into a 3 or 4 acre garden. And we use these great ideas even as inspiration today on how we'll form and use our gardens. I've selected a few shots that you might like to see outside your window. A few of them are very grand, but then some of the shots that come right after them are how you might scale it down to make your own idea of a fantasy garden or paradise. A man's home is his castle. Not everybody has a castle, but you could also see where a very nicely staged planting like this might be extremely attractive on a Cape Cod house or a little Tudor. Several layers, items that look good throughout the season. The essence of gardening can all be pretty much summed up in this picture. There's hardscape, there's contrasting of foliage, there's a lot of unusual different plants, and you can see how they've gone from light to dark to light to dark, limey green, whites, lots of different assortments. This is what I see outside my window every day, and it changes throughout the seasons. We can add great things to it. It has structure throughout the winter. So it's just great to have your idea of paradise right outside your window or door, whatever it may be. Large, complex gardens like this that are parterred or patterned can also be altered to smaller gardens like this that maybe have a central feature with a pool more our size, formal elements that give it strength throughout the season, grapevines that are grown less grand, things that we grow real well and even use in our gardens every day. Areas like this with stone paths and stone walkways, we so often leave unembellished. It cracks me up in the spring to see, perhaps in late March, all the landscapers out with their trucks mulching the banks. And usually in March or April, we'll want the soil to dry out so we can plant every square inch of the ground, but they constantly are interested in maintaining bare mulch. He who dies with the most plants wins. I mean, there's no other way of looking at it. If you cover the ground even with things that are temporary or more aggressive, it's a lot easier than maintaining bare ground. So in this particular picture, they've got bellflowers and thrifts and armerias and a lot of plants that bloom seasonally in the walkway. And of course, I'm sure they're carefully cut back as each of the blooms decline, or maybe they even take a weed eater to them, who would know? This is the garden at Alt Park, and what a great view it has. The taxes were planted by me at the time that I was there as a wreath to garland the view. The planting out the center at one time was flowers, and it brought your eye straight to the flowers instead of focusing on the long view across the lawn. So we took taxus and formed this parterre, pattern garden, in the shape of ivies or vines that to this day has grown into a very attractive landscape. Looks great throughout all seasons. But things that are this grand can actually be downsized to something that's this grand. Right outside the window of the house at Barnsley, Rosemary Beery's famous garden, she's the ultimate planter's woman and has two little knots like this right outside her window that you can imagine provide great texture and interest throughout the year. A garden based on structure, not really on flowers. Flowers are a lot of work. A great view at Hidcote that captures a view of the sky beyond. Notice how they've elevated the steps to capture the sky. But we can take and steal these type of ideas, even in our own garden. And this is a view of our garden towards the top of the hill where it views into the sky. There's a gate up there now and an alley, which is a grouping of trees that frames the view even further. But we can take these great ideas and scale them down to ideas that we use ourselves. Wouldn't it be great to see these type of things, right outside your door? Patterned gardens like this that are comprehensive and very hard to take care of, very grand and beyond the scope of the home gardener, can be taken to a different level. Here they've used vegetables, some of the heirloom varieties in different patterns, and patterned them out into a pattern garden. The whole vegetable garden was as attractive as any ornamental garden you might see, and it was all based on 22 or 24 of these squares, each with individual combinations of vegetables, one more attractive than the next. It's not what you grow, it's how you present it and the idea behind your scheme. A nice yard like this with the alley of limes, which is actually a basswood to the left, a mixture of perennials, a great courtyard. Once again, something like this could be transformed to a small garden. Large flowing beds of perennials can also be transformed to perhaps a garden like this that has unusual small herbs, things that are colorful throughout the season, a wonderful marble bowl on a wonderful brick display pad where the chard's been broken to look like a sunburst pattern. And all within the structure of this little garden, 10 by 20, that has unbelievable delight and power throughout all seasons. Notice in the last picture, the red succulent in the middle was a type of hens and chickens, something that we're very familiar with, but how attractive when used in mass. Another little garden room, pretty grand to size, but these are the types of things that we can accomplish in our yard if we just think big and act with the materials and things that we can salvage. Look at that wonderful view, multi-layered. I have this idea about gardening and composition. When you get past 5 layers of plants or elements, the mind can't decipher them all at once, and it stays busy looking over the elements and reanalyzing them time after time, and actually makes excitement in a garden when the garden can't read all the images at one time. And as you see, stone in the front, a little border of cotoneaster, the pond, the statues behind, the squirrels on a pedestal, the beech hedge behind 2 different types of beech. And once you get those layers, your eyes just can't keep from looking at it. Smaller ideas can be achieved. Like I said, great ideas can be taken and brought down to the smallest of size. This is a pool I put in our yard some time ago. Lots of perennials with different colors. A lot of the old-fashioned plants and heirloom plants that were brought to America were among the best of performers. Most of them do really easily just scratched into the soil in spring and water. A lot of them have very large flowers, a lot of bang for the buck, and you don't see a lot of the little dainties and specialty plants among the heirloom plants listed. Most of them are garish and big performers. In a garden that's getting established, though, that's the best thing that you want. There's nothing like castor beans or love lies bleeding, love in a mist, things that drop seed and cover the ground while the plantings become more mature or established. A wonderful garden, just as an entranceway garden, but look at the color palette that's been used with the roses and the clematis and the bellflowers. Too often we want too much color, and we're best served if we stick within a palette. Perhaps the hot colors or the cool colors or less can be a lot more. Garish seems to be the word in modern floral desires, but colorful combinations, careful colorful combinations, try that one, can be a lot more powerful than color itself or raw color. Everybody wants the same thing. Everybody needs a place to sit and enjoy the meal. Everybody wants a place to sit and read, watch the television or computer. Everybody needs the love of a family member or someone to share their life with. Gardening is a lot like the old proverb, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? Well, if you don't have an outlet for sharing your love of whatever it is, whether it be gardening, horticulture, then does it really exist or did it really exist? So it's such a pleasure to be able to share things that you're interested in, and that's part of the impetus behind our opening our garden every year, is because if we had a beautiful place and nobody ever saw it, was it ever really beautiful? Some of the great ideas, like I said, are really not all the large ideas. These are 2 squares in a garden, and they've been planted with different varieties of creeping thyme. And the thyme likes it hot and dry, only gets a couple inches tall. The foliages can be blues and silvers and grays and nice colors. And then when they bloom, they can be these colors, a wonderful mosaic or tapestry of whites and blues and lavenders and reds. One of the most photographic little beds in the whole world that shows up time and time again in many gardens, and it's been many times replicated, sometimes in dwarf varieties of dianthus, and by a friend of mine in hens and chickens, where you might have 600 varieties in a 20 by 20 area in his little garden. This man pretty much follows what we believe in. He lives in Queen City, a real rough area of town, on Queen City Avenue. He has his place behind closed doors, but when you walk into his house, behind his house, in his yard, he has a greenhouse, a big glass door in his garage where you can see his Mercedes sitting. He has a greenhouse filled with cacti and succulents that all come to the landscape for the summer. A huge water garden is half the size of his yard with lotus, and it's filled with flowers and hens and chickens, hammocks and fantasy things. He's purchased 2 of the other neighboring houses, knocked down the yard walls, and you can walk into the other yards, and there are decks and garden vignettes with lights and benches. So once again, it's not where you live, it's about how you live and the effort that you make with your garden, with your life. Wouldn't this be a nice, simple thing to see outside your door every day? Or this? These great ideas. This is the garden at Barnsley once again. This was British Garden of the Year in 1992. And the garden itself is only about 4 acres. And these are very to scale gardens. This water garden, 20 by 30, has a very shallow bottom, and you can see the stonework in the bottom that makes a pattern. It has a view along the vista. And then this is the temple that you view the garden from. Who has 15th century temples available for their gardening projects? So, we can do some wonderful things with little sheds or little buildings, but kind of have to stay in our league. With gardening and garden design, at our house, it's a 1871 farmhouse, and there's many things that we like and we're interested in. But the most important thing about good design is that the gardens are appropriate and artful. I'm reminded of a landscape designer that did a show at the Chelsea Flower Show, some Dutch guy, and he did this far out thing with all these galvanized metals and interesting, new age material, and it was a really neat show for a garden. But then he started getting commissions all over his region, and he published a book. Well, the book has some of the most normal houses that you would ever see, with the craziest backyards that you could ever imagine. And yeah, it was great that he won this award and got some freedom, but man, they should have pulled back on the reins a little bit. What he did just wasn't appropriate. This is Big Boone Gardens in the late spring, early summer. We like many things that reseed, that come and go. We've got many heirloom plants. There's wonderful seed lists. One of Michael Rouse's favorites is Seed Savers. And Seed Savers specializes in many heirloom varieties of tomatoes and vegetables, old heirloom varieties that we pass along, striped tomatoes, interesting gourds, really great things like that. And when you, some of these things are available for very, very cheap amounts actually. My favorite sources for the last 20 years has been the North American Rock Garden Society, and it's called NARGS. And the membership is somewhere around $20 for the year. They send you out 4 pamphlets of someone's travels to the mountains, and they talk about rock garden plants. And it's kind of a highbrow magazine, but in the back there's wonderful listings of other seed sources. But as a member, once a year, they send you this listing that's beyond belief. And it looks something like this. And it's just a list, and it's all text. But there's about 6,000 varieties of seed that are available in here. If you talk about alliums, there's 120 different alliums listed. If you talk about columbines, there's 85 different columbines listed. If you talk about dianthus, 200 varieties of dianthus listed. Hardy geraniums, 60 or 70 varieties listed. At one time I worked at a garden center and I knew everything the garden center sold. So I thought I knew everything. Well, this man came in one day, and a doctor, and I chatted with him. I said, well, what do you grow? What do you collect? And he said, well, I collect pachypodiums. And that's a Madagascar dragon plant, or a Madagascar plant from the thorn forest that looks like a little plug with leaves on the end, and you might have seen them one time. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Okay. Well, I did further research, and I found out there were 23 different species of pachypodium. So, you know, he wasn't collecting all the same thing. He was just so much further advanced in my knowledge that, you know, even with my 10 years experience at the time, I had no idea of the complete width and breadth of what was out there. So it's just amazing to see, you know, what you can find in a source like this. Unbelievable. The Scottish Rock Garden Society also publishes a bulletin, and they have a seed list that's very similar. It has about 6,000 seeds in it. Things you wouldn't believe, the depth and breadth of things that are available. I mean, it's just unfathomable. I hope you all have a chance to look at this for a second before you go. Many of the neat old-fashioned heirlooms I've gotten from the seed list. One of the neat things I grew in Alt Park was Nicotiana glauca, and it's a flowering tobacco. You may know the ones that grow about 3 feet tall with the white flowers that are fragrant, but this one is glauca, meaning blue. Well, it grew 6 to 8 feet tall. It looks like a eucalyptus with big, shiny, blue, waxy leaves, and then it had fragrant turquoisey yellow flowers that hang in bells from 8-foot tall plants. So there's just some crazy things that are out there if you do the research. It's important that maybe you get a book. The Bailey book is really good, Liberty High Bailey, or you can probably go online and research some of the things, or consult an American garden writer like Louise B.B. Wilder or Mrs. Frances King, or someone that wrote about gardening in our area where things really apply. And using an English book as a reference source is a big mistake, because things just don't do well. We've tried the blue Mecanopsis, the blue Himalayan poppy. We've had it come up, and as soon as it gets hot, it just wilts away to nothing. So we need some good sources of people who have grown these things lately so we don't lose our choices. The first 3 or 4 years, I chose things that I didn't know what they were, because that seems like a logical way to try different things. Well, what I found was that most of the things that I was ordering that I didn't know what it was, they were common weeds. Things that I pull out of the garden all the time. Because I had no interest in them, I never learned what they were. So even some of the craziest weeds are distributed around the world. We usually try about 30 things a year. The charge is something like $12 for the seeds for 30 selections. If you give 10 selections a year, you send in 10 of your seeds, you get 10 more to choose from. After they've done the complete draw, they send you a list of what's left, and you can choose from what's left at a rate of something like 40 packets for $4. So you can build up a seed bank of all these great things that you can try, you know, at your leisure just by being involved with a group like this. Isn't that exciting? You can see a lot of the things that we have, we've grown from seed. A lot of the things that we have drop seed and, you know, can be somewhat thuggish, but it's fun to have 5 acres and let things grow the way they want to. And we have great pleasure with that. The garden never ceases to give us pleasure. There's many things that we grow year after year that we've tried, that we want to have more of, that we want to have for our customers, that we would like to try. And I have a list of some of the things that give us great pleasure. One of the things that I like the most year after year is the dwarf crepe myrtle. We may know crepe myrtle is a 20-foot tall plant that grows down south or in the Carolinas or on the Virginia coast. But the crepe myrtles are now available, have been for some time, in small plants 2 or 3 feet tall. And they bloom starting in the middle of the summer, and they bloom all the way till frost. When the foliage emerges in the spring, it's this interesting orange overlaid on green that emerges that's unlike almost any color in the garden except for perhaps some of the spirilleas. The plants can be unbelievable range of colors. We have probably 15 colors, but we collect the seed from the white. The white is actually a mutant that came from sowing seeds many, many times. And when I sow the seeds to the white crepe myrtle, I sow a flat of them and pick them out as they come out. And a little bit later on, they're pricked out and put in the 4-inch pots. And they do so well, they bloom the first year from seeds in 4-inch pots. But not only are they white, but they're magenta, they're watermelon colored, they're dark lavender, they're light lavender, they're rich purple, they're shades of white, they have darker foliage, they have small foliage, and each plant has a difference from the time that it's young. Some have little teeny leaves, some have bigger leaves, some grow more upright, and to have 20 or 30 of those every year that I can assess and sort by colors and add to my clients' gardens is just truly a blessing year after year. Lots of times they'll die back all the way to the ground, but that's no problem because they grow 2 to 3 foot every year and have those intense flowers, the same color palette as azaleas provide from the heat of the summer through early fall. So they're invaluable in our seed sowing crop. Another thing that I really like that I choose out of the categories on the seed list are the hardy foxgloves. We know foxglove digitalis purpurea. It has big fuzzy leaves, and when it blooms, it has big purple flowers with purple spots on the inside on big scapes. But the hardy foxgloves are altogether different. They bloom year after year. The foliages are evergreen, unbelievably evergreen. Some of them are just plain green, but some of the later blooming species are covered with white tomentose hair or fur. They make bold, striking rosettes to 10 or 12 inches in the landscape, and then they bloom May and June, depending on the variety. The May ones tend to be yellows and whites, or even like a bicolor, but some of the later ones are this tall in the shade border, sun or shade, combinations of copper and yellow flowers or orange flowers, like the species of Parviflora, which means many flowers. So we have maybe 15 or 17 of those that are completely hardy and drop seed. If you leave the scape on and bang it later in the year, you'll hear the seed just dropping by the hundreds, and they come up in the shade border and persist all winter. So it's just something, fantastic to try that's very, very different. As far as things that we plant year after year, usually what we try to do is we don't heat our greenhouse because it's expensive. But we do start our own annuals, many, many different things, and sometimes they're generally not ready until maybe June. But if we bolster our garden and our flower beds with things that are hardy, that last longer, then we've got color in the garden, and we do our plantings in June. So there's a few things that we grow several flats of every year, just so we have them for the spring garden, and when they're done, we can place our spring plantings in, and they're right on time. Usually I try to grow a flat or so of each of these. When you sow your seeds, sometimes if you get like columbines or foxgloves, you get a ton of them. So don't sow more than you think you have a use for it. I'm reminded of this local nursery, and they've been in business quite a while now. They're on Frogtown Road, but their name will become nameless. But the first or second year that we were over there, they had sown Lunaria, the money plant, and it's kind of a rank biennial. The first year it's basil rosette, and then it blooms. Very attractive flowers, tall, either white or purple in shade, can grow in shade, and it has those interesting money things. Well, they must have planted up every one of them that survived, or every one that made it, because in their nursery, underneath their shade house, they had 4 tables, twice as big as these, filled with 6-inch Lunaria. They were only $3.99. Well, the nurserymen, you might sell 6 of those a year, but they had tables and tables and tables of them. So have a plan for what you're growing. And if you suspect you won't need that many, just sow a portion or half of the seeds. We just got a great kick out of that, seeing their Lunaria crop, because they didn't have the heart to throw the seed away. Columbines, once again, are something that we grow. You grow them the first year, they bloom the second year lightly. The second year lightly. And the secret to having a good columbine is after the flower blooms, cut the flower off immediately. And what that does is make the plant bigger and coarser, many offshoots, and the plant doesn't run its complete cycle and go to seed. If you let those small little columbines bloom their one bloom and let that go to seed, that's the end of the plant's life and it dies out. If you cut it after it blooms without letting it go to seed, it makes a big sturdy clump that might have 15, 20, or 30 flowers the second year. And then how do you get that to persist? Well, once again, you might cut almost all the flowers off, but leave 1 or 2 to go to seed, so you have a place for seed to form. When it forms, you can either collect it or just flick it, and then the dust-like seed will settle on, and the main plants can live for many, many years if you don't let them go their full cycle and go to seed. So that's a trick. The purple foxglove, once again, we use out front. You might pop those in here and there. Very easy to grow. Bloom strikingly the second year. About 3 or 4 flats of pansies usually does the trick for us. We grow those in late summer. They spend all winter in the greenhouse, which is an unheated greenhouse. And by spring, there's usually 4 or 6 really nice flats for the garden with no extra heat required. Sometimes I'll buy them at half off at Home Depot or 75% off when they're $4 or $5 a flat, and put them in 4-inch pots. In the spring, I've got all this wonderful material to work with. Also, Sweet Williams. Sweet Williams can bloom late into May, and we might start 2 or 3 flats of those, because those will be the basis of our color in our annual beds until our annuals are ready. Wallflowers, Curianthus, can also serve the same purpose, and we might plant, a flat or so of those year after year. There's many other seed categories that we're interested in. You try to grow things that you're going to have some success with. The things that we sow every year, probably half of the things live in the garden and stay in the garden, and half don't. That's a pretty good percentage, if you're talking about year in and year out in the life cycle of a gardener. It's great being a gardener because, from my point of view, we have a winter around here, and gardening is not a year-round feature. So we have about 7.5, 8 or 8 months a year that we garden. If you're in the business, you usually count on 32 to 35 weeks. But since I have my own garden, it's very elaborate. An old house that always needs care. Big collection of gardening and gardening memorabilia and many other hobbies. Gardening as a profession is great for me because it provides me time to pursue other interests and other things. I think if I lived in a climate that was not so temperate, I might die out there in the field. So it's nice to have time to, let things settle, do some research. Among my prized possessions is all the books that belong to Krippendorf, who started the Cincinnati Nature Center. And I bought them at auction, and they're a collection of about 40 books from the turn of the century with his name and his wife's name inscribed in them in very fancy lettering. Many of the books from authors that they must have attended their speaking sessions and were autographed to them personally. But to go through those things in the wintertime, feeling that Mr. Krippendorf must have done very much the same thing during his wintertime is just a great honor and gives me a great feeling of spirit during the wintertime. Like I said, there's many things to do in the wintertime besides gardening, but there are things to do in the wintertime if you choose to garden. We've been out all winter grubbing out roses, working on firewood, cutting up brush, preparing new beds by digging them their first time, and letting Mother Nature beat down the clay into a soil that we can work with. Stonework, there's all kinds of great things for the wintertime. Wonderful to have a miniature garden or something special right outside your window, day in and day out. Like Oscar Wilde said, the best revenge for anything is living well. Though we travel the world to find beauty, we must carry it with us or we find it not. Like I said, besides plants, there's a lot more to gardening than that. There's stonework, the introduction of gardening elements. A garden is a lot more than just a combination of plants. Once again, many of the things from that rock garden list are low alpine plants, things that are useful for the cracks in a walkway, the cracks in a patio, a small planter. So even if you don't have a elaborate gardening space, there's all kinds of ways that you can have and enjoy gardening in a small space. Here's a collector of alpines and rock garden plants. A very famous garden writer named Beth Chado has written many books on the subject, but notice how she's got a very controlled collection of some really neat small things. Well, we can collect these things and they grow real well. This is a collection at the Royal Botanical Garden at Kew, and these alpines, things from high mountain regions, are actually grown in a cooler where the soil underneath it is cool, so they maintain a 40-degree soil temperature. It was very fashionable at one time, even in upstate New York, to collect and grow alpines, and they would have a solar pit, which is a greenhouse dug into the ground that was air conditioned, so they could bring many of these alpine primrose and interesting things to flower in their home, in their gardens. Here's how we've chosen to adapt some of the miniature things. We've got a few troughs that we made from hypertupa, which is a fake lightweight cement. We also, this is one of them that's been in the garden for 20 years. We also have a collection of stone troughs, stone sinks that were carved from an old school at one time. And many of them just are a garden into themselves. I usually start the week in the garden by weeding these, and I can weed 4 of them in about 5 minutes. But if that's all you had, it'd be great. But you can see what a great little village of different things you can assemble in one place. Once again, many of them from the Rock Art Society. What a great texture and interest. This is a garden in Wisley, and this is a trial garden. They grow all the plants you ever heard of from around the world in trial beds. So you can look at hostas next to hostas, thistles next to thistles, epimediums next to epimediums, foxgloves by foxgloves, and then they harvest the seed and offer these as a seed bank to institutions all over the world. There's many organizations like this that have seed listings that offer. When I was at the conservatory, almost all the botanical gardens around the world offered seed lists of things that were free or for the asking. Once again, seeds aren't anything. Seeds are just an idea until you do something with them. Here's my wife at probably late in the 80s with big hair. You can tell what period it was by her hair size. Seeds have a wonderful power to do so many different things, not only in the world's history, but in our own lives. When I first started working at the conservatory, I went in on the first day and they said, you know, this will be where you sit. And I walked in and there was a stool for me, and there was a stool for the other gardener, and there was the director. And I thought, well, there's going to be, you know, staff of 10 or a staff of 20. Well, it was me and her and the director, and that's the only working staff at the conservatory. So it was great to be there after 30 years when the old director had retired. And after 30 years, you can imagine there was a lot of ability to make change on your own. A lot of things that could be done just through your efforts. And the landscape architect had just retired also, or was near retirement. And after 30 years of him designing 7 shows a year, 200 and some shows in his career, he was about out of ideas. So they turned the ideas over to the staff, and not only did we come at a great time and we could replant, but we could also design the shows and do our thing. Well, we had this idea. We had been doing the seed thing for years and years, and we ordered extra seed. Well, we used, my wife was in charge of the horticulture program at Withrow High School at the time, and we used her program and volunteers that we solicited from the Crown to start seeds. And these seeds, we grew miniature hostas, different salvias, all kinds of fun stuff. And every time the show ends, they'd have an end-of-show sale, and they'd sell all the plants that were left from the show. Well, usually it'd be around $300, $350, because you were buying things that were worn out. Well, we had all these things that we grew behind the scenes. We had cacti and succulents that we grew in the parking lot, things that we grew on the steam lawn. When I started, there was one volunteer that worked with the staff, and when I left, there were between 60 and 80 volunteers that worked with the horticulture staff for projects like this. Our sales went from $350 a sale to somewhere near $3,000 to $4,000 each sale. So instead of wading through the red tape, we had money to buy new plants. We could buy new props for our shows. We could afford to insure props that we borrowed so we could use them. We bought stones and rocks and different things that we could use in the shows and then put them out in the landscape. So just the fact that we could start seeds, we had a labor force, and we had an idea, we were able to generate a wonderful change in the conservatory and how it dealt with the public's interests and needs, as well as replanting the whole conservatory. 3 years later, 7 years later, when I went to Alt Park, on the site was an old greenhouse down the service road, and it had been used at one time, heated with wood, by the 5 gardeners that were at Alt Park. But that was in the park's heyday, and things were misaligned. And once again, we fired up the seed bank, got volunteers to start working with us. We restored the garden, the greenhouse on the site, put plastic on it, cleaned out the cold frames, and we grew near 500 flats of unusual things for the park. So in the three years that I was there, we planted companions for all the roses, changed the profile of the park from just annuals in the long beds to all those mixed beds that were there during that time. That was also during the time of the early flower show, and since we were there doing great things for the parks, it was easy to ask people to leave things after the flower show for the parks. And because we had done so much, people were willing to accommodate us because everyone likes the winter. Once they see things that are happening, it's easy to get support. And I can't help but believe we changed the whole way that people looked at the park. The 3rd year that I was there, the members of the community commissioned a study of a redesign of the park. They got water into the park to water the lawns again, and spent $170,000 on the master plan, revisiting the master plan, of which I got to contribute to greatly. So I can't help but think that I've made my own luck from just with the seeds and what we put out there in the world. So seeds have great power. Among the things that we grow from seed and that we sell Many of the things, after you get a crop established and it drops seed, you don't have to go through the tedious process of starting seed. You just gather them up, pot them up. This is hellebores. The hellebores were the perennial plant of the year about 4 years ago, and they are one of the best plants for growing in shade or dry shade. They'll grow in our gnome garden under cedars, and they look like this today. They grow 2 feet tall, and they look like this today. They bloom starting in late March and bloom for almost 2 months. Big waxy flowers, purple, whites, greens, and then they look like that all year long in shade. See them emerging in the springtime. This is in late February. The flowers are about 2 inches in diameter and very waxy. Very old plant. Goes way back to the 16th century. Much prized. But I like the purple ones are more in vogue, but I actually like the yellow and green ones because they'll lighten up a dark area much better. We usually sell those in a flat for $25 for a flat that might have 32 small plants. And it sounds like a great deal, but they're the smallest plants that you can imagine. They just sit there. The first year they may grow 3 leaves. The second year they look a little bit better, but by the third year they're starting to flower already, and everyone lives, even if they're that small. So they're just an amazing plant to share and to grow. The list, seed list also lists near 200 varieties of primrose. So we select some of the primrose that do real well, the English cowslip, some of the polyanthuses, some of the obconicas and things that we read about. And even though primroses don't last long, sometimes 3 or 4 years, if the seeds are free and you can get them going, there's a real reason to try. There's some other wonderful ones. These were Besiana, once again grown from seed, and they usually bloom second year from seed. Lots of things available. This is one of my gardening treasures. This is a rare peony called the fern-leaf peony. It blooms 2 months before most other varieties of peonies do, a month and a half. The foliage emerges, tinged with bronze, and very, very attractive. The plant is small, perhaps half the size of a normal peony, and it blooms this intense red. I grew this from seed that I got from the seed list, and it took about 4 years to finally reach blooming types. But seeds offer so many things that are not available in the trade. I couldn't afford to go out and buy 48 columbines at $3 each to pop in here and there, but I could start a whole flat for a couple dollars in soil and a plastic tray or two. So lots of things you can try. Many herbs and heirloom herbs are available through the seed list. The early gardens were almost all plants that were used medicinally. The pleasure part came later. This is a bronze fennel, a very attractive biennial that grows 5 to 6 feet, drops seeds freely. It's an excellent host for the one of the fancy butterflies. I think it's the fritillary. Don't recall at the moment. And then it's an edible fennel. The seeds are edible. Baptisia is another one available from the seed list. We know the blue one, but there's also a white one available, one that has smoky blue foliage and darker flowers. There's even some that have been hybridized in Louisville at the Theodore Klein Garden that have come back to us in moonlight shades of light yellow, medium purple, rich ruby. They're a wonderful perennial that gets 3 to 4 feet tall. They bloom in the early spring, but the main thing is the foliage looks like this all season long. Attractive, pest-free, likes full sun, a little slow to grow and can never be moved or divided, but just a wonderful choice among heirloom things. The feverfew is listed in Gerard's Apothecary, one of the early plants brought to the United States. But this is a wonderful golden variety, little golden flower with a yellow eye, quite attractive, perennial, drop seeds here and there, and you can imagine that nice chartreuse foliage, very popular and trendy color for the days today, but a good plant grown from seed.
Also on the seed list are the euphorbias, and they're related to our Christmas poinsettia. You wouldn't guess it, but they're very easy. They bloom chrome yellow flowers early in the season. The foliage looks very attractive all season long in sun. Many different varieties, and then they have a bonus in the fall. Each leaf turns a different color: yellow, rose, persimmon. If it's the evergreen type, every needle turns a different color in the fall, and then they drop seed all over. It's not one you can depend on as a ground cover, but it comes up here and there and persists in the garden. Lots of great things to try. Another herb, this is the herb of grace, rue. And rue is grown for its foliage. It's very attractive. It also has countless uses in the apothecary for tinctures and ointments and things of that nature. But it has a wonderful blue color, and it's almost like an evergreen. It's kind of woody, grows a couple feet tall. Sun or shade, mostly sun. And just one attractive foliage for any garden. Santolina is also a little member of the daisy family. Little yellow aspirin-like flowers on a small plant, sometimes used for hedging. Remember earlier we looked at the parterre, the pattern. This would be a good plant for using in a pattern garden. Very slow growing, shrub-like, and the species, both green, virens, and this one, Camasiparissus, are evergreen with that neat foliage. Easy from cutting, great border. The salvias or sages are real easy. You might not know it, but there's 1,000 or 1,200 varieties of salvia. One of the greatest ones that we grow is the clary sage. And the clary sage makes a big, broad rosette of silver crinkled foliage that's this big in diameter. And then when it blooms in late spring, early summer, blue flowers that become pink, and the flowers are as big around as maybe 1.5 inches in diameter and 3 feet tall, like crazy shrimp that open, that go from pink to purple and then drop seed all over. So very large and striking. There's a woman visited our garden, and she was not seeing this, the tricolor sage, but the clary sage. And she asked what it was, and I said it was a salvia. And she said, "That's not a salvia. I know salvia." And I said, "Well, there's 1,200 species. How many of them do you know?" And ended that conversation. We always wondered why the lady was a know-it-all, and then we met her mother. This is another really neat. This is another neat herb that has been grown since time immemorial. It's one of the thistles. This is the blessed thistle, the sacred thistle, Solibium marianum. It's also called the milk thistle. It makes a broad rosette the first year. Very attractive, as you can see, waxy and thick with this crazy white veination. In the second year, it becomes more thistle-like and blooms and then dies. So it's not one of those that becomes a thug, but just a real interesting addition to the garden. The devil's claw is one that's very interesting. It's called Proboscidea, Louisiana, designating it was from Louisiana at one time. This plant's used a lot in the Southwest. They use the fiber for the plant for making baskets. And when you see the patchy basket with the dark coloring in it, it's very often from the devil's claw that grows in the Southwest. Easy to start from seed. It has a 5-inch long seed pod that looks like a crazy forked bird. And when the seed disperses, it splits open to make this interesting little bird that's sometimes used, 2 of them together to make a donkey, or one back to back that makes a bird. Real interesting seed pod that's much beloved by people that work with dried. And this plant is about 2 feet tall and maybe 7 feet in diameter. It has that neat blue-green foliage that's very attractive and indestructible. And the flowers, even though they don't seem like much, upon close inspection, they look like a combination between a gloxinia, which has that fuzzy big bell, and maybe a geranium. It's a flared flower with a yellow and pink inside, but drought resistant and tough. These are the kind of plants we use in big borders with grasses and shrubs to fill in while they mature. The verbascums, you may know the moth mullen that grows along the roadside. They used it for when you have a hole in your shoe, you put one in your shoe to block the hole. It was used for poultices and many early American medications. And it grows all over, usually in waste places. This is the plant with the big yellow spikes that I'm talking about. Usually we see it as a bushel basket size broad rosette in waste areas. Well, this is the interesting species. The flowers are much more attractive, and there's a lot of them listed from around the world, different ones. We've tried quite a few. The foliage, of course, is attractive, but if you select one like Oreophyllum, it blooms a yellow flower this tall and that big around, this great big yellow torch, and it blooms early along with Oriental poppy instead of in the summer or later. The moth mullins are also from that group, and they can be sunset shades, pinks and lavenders, and drop seed all over. Many from that variety that are very valuable as gardening plants.
Stop. Okay.
859
No.
384 1949. But we have a lot to look at our place. The columbines, like I said, there's hundreds of choices. Some that are variegated splashed with yellow and cream. Some that are splashed with white. I usually try to get some of the ones that are big. Chrysantha can be 3 feet tall with yellow flowers. Some of them, like Hobbit, can be a couple inches tall with green flowers that look like spaceships. But I try to order, 4 or 5 different ones that I've never seen before to try and share. This is another group that I'm interested in, Phlomis. And it's a member of the mint family. And they're just crazy. It looks like these 3-inch balls, and the stem goes right through the middle of the balls with 4 balls on top. This one is fruticosa, but we also grow tuberosa, which is pink, and 3 or 4 others. They're good woolly leaf garden plants that get shrubby in size, and then have these crazy flowers with the stem going right through the middle. Phlomis, Phlomis. The dianthus, as I spoke about, the sweet williams are biennial and only last a second year. But many of the varieties, like this one, the cheddar pinks, are perennial and come back year after year. And they offer dark varieties and light varieties, some that are fragrant. They're all in the members of the carnation family, and there's hundreds available. This is another dianthus, Dianthus napi.